Okay, my button may not look really great right now, but let's play with it a little bit and see what happens. Before I do that though, let me add another button and let's take a look at it. Since when I created this button, I said apply to all, now every single button that I create will use this template. In effect, I've gone to the template that Windows defines and replaced it with my template. So now every button in my entire application will look like this unless I override its template. In effect, I've created a new default state that I can move elsewhere. Now, let's look at that content presenter a little bit. The word button is the default content for any button that gets created. Let's take a look in my property inspector, and you'll see that my content is, yes, set to the word button. Anything that I change it to, the content presenter is going to update with that particular text. Now, it's not centered or anything like that. I can fix that by going back into the template, but I want to show you what else you can do with a content presenter. I'm going to grab a rectangle, and I'm going to drop it down on my artboard. I'm going to convert this to a path. I'm going to edit it a bit with the pen and direct selection tools. Now, I'm going to go back to the selection tool and I'm going to drag it to my button. Watch what happens when I move over the button. A dashed line appears and I get a message indicating that an Alt drag will place it into the button. I can tap the Alt key and now this geometry that I've created becomes the new content. So as soon as I release it, the shape that I've created replaces the existing content and I get this form. The content presenter can display any kind of content, and the content can be text, it can be a video clip, it can be an animation, it can be other geometry. In fact, it can even be other controls. I can resize my content from the inside, and since my content presenter is centered, the content that I drop into the button will also be centered. Now, if I want to take that one step further, I can even grab the button itself. I need to click back on the artboard to deselect, and then select my button. I can drag it and move it into the other button. So in effect, I've set the content of the larger button to be the smaller button, and the content of the smaller button is that unusual Z shape that I created before. So now I've actually created this stack where I have one button that contains another button that contains some shapes. Now if you want to do this, there are situations where you might want this particular format, but something you need to keep track of is where the events are going. Let's modify my template a little bit, and I'm going to add a property trigger to my template so that when I click on the button, I want it to turn red. This will be a nice quick change, so I'm going to add a property. When my target element is pressed, I'm going to change the property of the rectangle to be red. Now, let's step out from here and run my application. Now, when I'm over the center button and I click the mouse, you'll see that my center button turns red, but the outer button doesn't. If I move out here to where the outer button is, I press the button and the outer button turns red, but the inner button doesn't. You need to make sure that when you're using controls embedded within controls in this style, that where the user clicks is going to specify which individual control gets the behavior. Now let's take a look at something else. Let me switch back. Let me close this application. And let's select my outer button. Now the outer button has got background, border brush, foreground, and so on. Let's try modifying those properties. Now as I modify the background, I don't see any change in my button on the artboard. Why is that? The button on the artboard is white, the rectangle within it is white, and I'm setting background, which is a completely unrelated property. I haven't specified in my template how I want to use the properties of the button. Let me show you what I mean by all that. Let me right-click on my button. Let me edit the template again. And I'm going to select my rectangle. Now, I want the fill of my rectangle to match the background that's being passed to me from the button. So if the user modifies the background property of the button, I want the brush that they create to be used for the fill of the rectangle here. This is a type of binding, not completely unlike data binding, but in this case, it's called template binding. I'm going to click on the property marker next to the fill, And you'll see down at the bottom I have template binding. This is only available when you're working in a template logically enough, and when I select that, I see all of the different properties that my button has: the background, the border brush, the foreground, and the opacity mask. So if I template bind the fill of my rectangle to the background property of my button, when I move back up to my application, you'll see that now I'm setting the background of my button to different colors. And since the background of my button template binds into the fill of my rectangle changes color to match that background. Now I can use any of those properties in any way that I want. Let's take, for instance, the border brush. Go back into my template, go to my rectangle, select the stroke, and template bind it to the border brush. Now, as I bind each one of these controls, my user has the ability, or I have if I'm using the control, to set the properties on the button and have those propagate inward. Template binding is a great way to allow variability between your buttons. So now if I drop down another button, I can modify the background, and I can modify the border brush, and as I make these changes, the geometry for my buttons is kept the same, but the look and feel is modified by the properties on the button themselves.